Hello and welcome to a brand new podcast in a different league, the place for traditions, tactics and tips on the official and original fantasy football game. We're your hosts, Chris Pilau.
And me, Jessy Humphreys.
And here's what you can look forward to on this, the first ever episode.
We'll be bringing you up to speed on the Fantasy League season so far, all the best and worst performing players in the game, who to stick with, who to get rid of. I've already axed some players from my team, but we'll have you covered looking at who's performing well.
We take the first of many deep dives into all the weird and wonderful different leagues out there. This week, we kick off with the Garrett Lane Wines Fantasy League.
And look, we both play the game. We know there's been a bit of upheaval at the start of the season, a couple of teething issues so far. Neil Mansfield from the Fantasy League head office joins us in part 3. We'll answer some questions from our listeners on this, our official fantasy football podcast in a different league.
So here we are at last, the Fantasy League podcast, 8 weeks into the Premier League season. Jessy, it's good to be finally recording. All good with you?
Yeah, it's exciting, isn't it? Obviously, we've sort of had this in the pipeline now for a little while, and it feels great to be, getting going. It's good to be starting, I think, in the international break, having our minds turned back to the return of the Premier League on the weekend.
Yeah, definitely. And look, I suppose our listeners will want to know why they're here. Well, not why they're actually here. Look at us, 30 seconds in, answering the big existential questions. No. Why they're here listening to this podcast, what they're going to get from it. There'll be people who've been playing the game for decades, years, some only a matter of months, weeks. What do you think is the best way of describing what we're trying to achieve here, what they're going to get out of it? Yeah, what will they hear on this pod?
First and foremost, we want to have this podcast as a bit of a celebration, really, of the game of Fantasy League. You and I have both been playing for pretty significant chunk of time. We know there's lots of people who'll be listening who've also had Fantasy League as a big part of their footballing lives for a number of years, and we just wanted to be able to show the game in all of its uniqueness and give it a bit of love, but also look, we know everyone's playing Fantasy League because they want to win. You want those bragging rights over your mates, and we're hoping that we might be able to give you a little bit of those tips and tricks that might give you the edge as the season goes on, as well as shining a light on all those weird and wonderful leagues that exist, the funny little quirks that everyone has. I think in the build up to preparing for this podcast, I've really had a light shone on how many different unique ways there are of setting up at the league that you're in and playing Fantasy League. And, that's obviously what makes it such a special game, Chris, but just feel like we want everyone to get to see what's going on in the big old Fantasy League world.
Yeah, look, I think that's one of the reasons why we called it in a different league. We want to find out about all those different leagues. We keep talking about the tips, and yes, we will be giving tips and advice, but I feel it's very rich. I mean, I'm currently sat fourth in my league, haven't ever won it before, and I'm going to mean everyone in my league is going to...
yourself. I'm top of my league, and I've won 3 of the last 4 seasons. So, guys, come to me, not Chris, for the tips, clearly.
All the tips from Jessy. I can tell you how to put loads of thought into the auction and then, overthink it and then always end up in mid-table. If that's what you want to do, I can consistently have you finished in mid-table.
I feel like you're the sort of Roy Hodgson of Fantasy League. You're going to be solid. You'll get the job done, but you're not going to be moving up the league.
Well, look, as a Crystal Palace fan, I'll take that. I'll take being the Roy Hodgson. And yeah, look, we want this to be an interactive pod. We want to get in touch with the Fantasy League community. Well, we want the Fantasy League community to get in touch with us. And so it'd be great to hear, all your questions, anything you want to ask Jessy, any tips and advice that you want Jessy if you want to become a champion. Is also going to be a very safe place where we can, maybe discuss the manual assists in a way that have never really been allowed to be discussed and debated before. To find out a lot about everyone out there, all the Fantasy League community who are playing this game, not only featured in part 2 where we will be kind of doing this deep dive with a different league every week, but also to hear from you guys and anything you have on a weekly basis. So we're kicking this off 8 weeks into the season. The narratives are all set. The Premier League's taken shape. So it has as well in Fantasy League land, fantasyleague.com. A lot of points have been scored already, some -1s too. Should we start by looking at the best performers so far? Like you said, it's the international break, 8 weeks in. And who would have thought it that Ollie Watkins tops the best performers so far this season? I actually had a look in my league, and we think it goes all the way back for more than a year that Haaland hasn't been sat on top of that table. What a surprise!
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about the reason Watkins has done so well is, and I feel like this is a theme I've noticed in my team, is that this feels like the year of the assists. Because normally we have like a sort of proxy stat in my league that generally whoever's team managed to get the most goals normally sort of wins. And I feel like obviously that was, the big Haaland thing. Here's someone scoring more goals than ever before, but Watkins this season, 4 goals, 7 assists, putting him ahead of Haaland with 8 goals and 1 assist. And when we're looking at some of those top scorers, there's a lot of players who've just gone big on assists. So I've got in my team Julian Alvarez and Moussa Diaby, both of whom are in that top 10. Alvarez with 4 assists, Diaby with 5 assists. Do you think this is a trend we're seeing, Chris? That we've got these, players who are going to move towards sort of more of that double figures in goals and assists, and that actually it's that combination which is the real point scoring. Because I guess, especially when you look at players like Kane moving out of the Premier League, that Haaland aside, not many teams just have this one big goal scorer at the moment.
Yeah, it could be. Like when I said, by the way, as a Ollie Watkins owner myself, very big smile on my face. And it's worth noticing well, Watkins is 1 point ahead of Haaland at this stage, 26 points to 25. But one of the reasons of my overthinking in the auction was actually kind of looking at where those points were going to come from. And for me, with Watkins, looking for the set piece takers, but with Watkins, it was also the fact that he draws in a lot of fouls. And he's absolutely done that. A lot of those assists that he's scored, he's got 7 so far this season, have actually been penalty assists, winning the fouls for the penalties, and then potentially scoring the penalties as well, though he doesn't always take the penalties. I do know what you mean. Kind of like Haaland has kind of been there as a bit of like a false like friend there, kind of like thinking that that's the way to go. But as this sort of like out and out striker, because he's kind of like, we know that he's one of a kind, but he's one of the kind in fancy points as well. And you only need to look at Alvarez, who you have, to know sort of like the other sort of attackers out there and what they're doing. There isn't really like a number 9 playing in the same way that Haaland is so far this season. You see what Son brings to the Tottenham team, what Alvarez brings to City, what Salah and Saka, it's very much, I've noticed it over the last few years as well, the winger becoming the forward, which is kind of a bit of a contentious issue, especially, are they a midfielder or are they a striker? But a lot of them are becoming strikers now on the game. And it's kind of like that all-rounded approach, like you said, which they can bring to their teams and to the game. It's no surprise that there was a moment, I think it was 2 seasons ago, where there was a few fullbacks starting to populate this list. But for a long time now, it might seem quite obvious, but the sort of the midfielders and strikers, all greens and reds, as I say on the website, just populating this list quite a lot.
Looking at this list, I was just going to jump in and say, as a Crystal Palace fan, we should maybe talk about the one defender who's managed to pop up on here. So what have we got? This is the top 20 biggest scorers. Do you have Joachim Andersen in your team?
I don't have any. I know I've got Elise. I was going to say I don't have any players in my team. I've got Elise in my team, but he's obviously not scored points yet this season. But yeah, you're right. Anderson did not expect, as a Palace fan, either for him to be so high up in this list. Not only that, I was looking at the goalkeepers as well, and Johnston is the top goalkeeper in the game, 11 points ahead of Reyes, Sanchez, Edison. Like, someone in our league does actually have Johnston, and it's kind of that moment in the auction where he goes for him, and you're kind of thinking, God, it was his first ever auction, so you're thinking, this guy doesn't really know what he's doing. But I can't believe it that Palace are scoring so high in the defensive charts.
I guess that's one of the things, and we'll see how that pads out across the season. But I guess there's been some notable teams who maybe haven't done as well defensively. I went for Andre Onana in Manchester United, and United have not been great, particularly defensively, and I've had to drop him for Robert Sanchez. And I'm a Chelsea fan, but I don't think I'd have thought that I'd be dropping a highly rated goalkeeper for a sort of Brighton reject goalkeeper after eight weeks of the season or so.
One other thing I have noticed on that the overall point scorers so far in our league, at least, I know that every league will be different, of course, is that money and the auction actually, it counted for a lot, which sounds like an obvious thing to say, but if I look at my top scorers in our league and who owns who, that sort of top half of players, Watkins, Haaland, Salah, Saka, Son, they were all kind of some of the most expensive players in our league. There hasn't really been a massive surprise other than those Crystal Palace defenders, of course. But we kind of like got the impression in our league that we know what we're doing now. Ours is quite a young league in terms of, I've been playing for a while, but there are a few players, this league's only been running a couple of years, so a few players are only sort of like getting into the swing of things, and they're very much as a feeling of like, okay, we recognise the players, but maybe as well that it's kind of like the obvious ones have been the top scorers, if that makes sense. Have there been any surprises for you in the Premier League so far this season in terms of a higher point scorer, other than obviously those Palace defenders?
Yeah, I don't know if there's been surprises. I guess maybe there's players who potentially people thought would do better. For example, the most money I spent on a player was on Marcus Rashford, and he's not had an amazing start to the season. Kai Havertz also went for a lot of money, which I thought personally was, my dad bought Kai Havertz, and I think he'd reached panic stations at that point in terms of being like, oh, I need someone. But I was like, this man hasn't scored goals playing as a 9 for Chelsea. I don't know how he's going to score goals playing as an 8 for Arsenal, and that's kind of proven to be true so far. But it's been interesting seeing we had our first sealed bids last week, and there was some, again, big money spent on sort of players who hadn't been picked up before. I noticed Tayo Awoniyi's gone for 15 million in a sealed bid, which would put him, for us, 5th in terms of the most expensive players bought in the auction this year. So it's always funny when people suddenly look around at who they've ended up with and where they are in the league, and you get these incredibly inflated figures coming out for players.
Yeah, especially when there's not that much choice. And even, just before this international break, Man United playing against Brentford, it's players like when Scott McTominay scores 2 goals at the end, which will make some of those nervous, panicky managers just end up overspending for someone like Scott McTominay, and you kind of know that you're in a bit of trouble if you're entering that sort of territory of doing that.
Yeah, I think also that's always funny when you get people who maybe don't pay as much attention to the Premier League as other people, which is definitely something that we have in our league. That sort of, I think Fantasy League is sort of what keeps them interested, as opposed to sitting down and watching Match Today every week. So it'll get to the point where there's a sealed bids round, and they're just doing what we've basically done and looked at who the highest scoring players are, and you think, oh, Scott McTominay scored twice this season, and you don't really necessarily see it as potentially a bit of a strange, unlikely to be repeated fluke. But shall we move on and just have a look at some of the worst players? I'm actually astounded. Obviously, it's not surprising necessarily that there's a lot of Sheffield United, Burnley and Luton defenders rocking around this list. I was astounded at how many minus points Sheffield United defenders had managed to accumulate.
Yeah, it's not a good look, and like very sorry to any Sheffield United, Burnley or Luton fans listening, but when their team is performing like this, they just very quickly just become ignored in a league. You'd be a fool really to be even considering any of these players. It's basically this list is populated by the defenders and the goalkeepers of those teams. There might be people who are so desperate who are going for these players, maybe kind of like looking at the fixtures, maybe they can think they can get like 1 clean sheet, but otherwise there is just, you've got to admit there's no point going for these players at all in Fantasy League. And I don't know what that's like in your league, but it stretches, even into the midfield and strikers. I've got Cameron Archer for kind of Sheffield United, and there's like a hope that and maybe everything will go through him. But really, these teams unfortunately end up becoming a bit ignored.
Yeah, and I think there's always a temptation, and for a number of years I sort of did this and looked, okay, of the 3 promoted teams, who's the striker who scored the most in the Championship, and they feel like an easy person to maybe pick up for not much money, have the potential to do really well. But I've actually just been burnt so many times off that, because that step up is so big for a lot of these teams, to the point where if you just don't have the ball, even if everything would go through that player, it's not necessarily. Although I will say I was burnt several times by Mitrovic, and obviously then when he came up for like the gazillionth time with Fulham, he then finally did score a load of goals. By that point, I'd given up on it. But yeah, I think that's something that I always thought I was doing to get a bit of an edge, and I had to take a step back and be like, this is not, like, you were much better going off and buying the striker from the team you think are going to finish 10th or 11th than thinking you're going to uncover this gem who's going to finish sort of 19th.
Yeah, and it depends as well how often you have changeover in your league. If you've got a monthly, I know that there are some leagues out there which even have a weekly transfer window, then maybe you can start to be a bit clever here. And I'm very much one for, in our league, we have a monthly one. And one of the first things I'll do, it sounds obvious, but I will just look at the fixtures for every team. And if there is a team that is playing, that has a particularly good run, then maybe you do try and take a gamble to try and get ahead. But like I said, I at this moment in time, they're performing that much worse than the other Premier League teams that you're kind of like steering a bit clear. Let's be fair to them. It's not completely populated. We've got, again, a list of about 20 in front of us of the worst performing players. There are some Brighton players in there, and we wouldn't have thought that at the start of the season. I know they've had a difficult start, but they've been letting in a lot of goals under De Zerbi. And there was obviously that game against Villa. But yeah, I certainly didn't expect to see these Brighton players in here, right?
No, I definitely think Lewis Dunk is someone who's kind of towards the bottom of the worst performers. He's on -5. That's having scored a goal this season. And Dunk, I think, is definitely someone who, if you'd wanted to go for a little bit of a hipster centre-back pick, he would have been a good option. I steered clear of Brighton defenders mainly by accident, because I wanted 2 of their attackers, and we only have 2. You're only allowed to pick up 2 players per team in our league. That's one of those things that's really interesting when you're thinking about who you end up picking up, because where a team finishes in the league isn't always like a great indicator of, for example, how many goals they score versus how many goals they let in. E.g., obviously a team can finish mid-table, say, with roughly 0 goal difference, but they could have been just scored barely anything, but been incredibly mean. I guess Newcastle would be a good example, obviously finishing 3rd at the end of the season, but they weren't like prolific goal scorers. It was that they kept a ton of clean sheets. But you could equally have a team in that same position who let in an absolute ton of goals. I guess Liverpool are a team who also finished decently last season, but were just so leaky in defence.
And look, it's happening a lot. It's a general theme in the Premier League anyway this season. You only need to look at the sort of additional added time on the end. It is making a difference. And just generally, teams are conceding more. So whereas in the past, you kind of like, you could feel comfortable with just taking your defenders from the top 4 or 5 teams. Well, firstly, it's hard to know who the top 4 or 5 teams are in the Premier League anyway, and kind of how the ones playing in Europe, how they're going to be able to juggle both. But also, this season, there's just been, even some of those bigger teams are preparing to, they're just conceding more goals anyway. And like I said, it's the additional added time was a factor. It was spoken about a lot at the start of the season. Yeah, your defenders are expected to play for a lot longer now. The same with sort of like subbing off as well. The kind of like the opposite to that, the frustration of having a player like Zinchenko is a very good example of this for Arsenal. Arteta will always bring off Zinchenko, and if you're a Zinchenko owner, Arteta's like Arteta knows Arteta is bringing him off in like the 72nd minute, the 73rd minute. It's something that's happened in our league, that actually someone got rid of Zinchenko, sold him to another manager, because this was one of the big reasons, and the other manager wasn't too clued up on that. But it's kind of like these things that you need to look out for now, because is it worth having these big defenders, these big team defenders, if they're not going to score you the points? You need to have defenders on your team.
Yeah, well, and I guess that's also been the interesting change, I guess, with when there it felt like loads of attacking fullbacks, and how that sort of, changed. I guess, obviously, Trent Alexander-Arnold and Andy Robertson for a long time went as, some of the most expensive players in our league, because it was just felt like their attacking contributions would way outweigh, any sort of defensive mishaps that they might have. But obviously, as that's kind of changed, and it feels like, those players haven't been able to offer as much, suddenly you're back looking and being like, oh no, I need to think about how many goals this team concedes.
And especially on a kind of like a week-to-week basis, I think, that coming up after this international break, there are some big decisions to be made. Man City playing Brighton, Chelsea playing Arsenal, even the Merseyside derby, you kind of like those ones where you're not quite sure, do you play the defenders or not? a lot of managers are going to be left with big choices to make. I think what's been interesting with Man City over the last few weeks before the international break is obviously without Rodri being in the team, how something like that has affected it's affected their team, and kind of like whether even things like that happening in a team might influence your choices in your fantasy league team, if that makes sense. So, seeing how Man City, just at the moment, Pep hasn't worked out a way for them to play without Rodri. And so then if you are presented with an opportunity where, say, Rodri becomes injured or suspended again, is that the sort of like decision that you could be making? Okay, well, actually, maybe I won't play my Man City defence this week because I know that Rodri hasn't been in the team, for example. And maybe some managers can be a bit clever that way.
I will say I'm always just a stickler for basically getting 4, max 5 defenders. So I never am really in a position like my defence, like once they've been selected, they are in, because we have squads of 15 and I always just fill my subs bench with attackers, just because I think they offer so much extra points value ultimately than defenders. But yeah, I think it is obviously something that's worth keeping an eye on and worth thinking about. I feel like with City it's hard because even having, lost 2 games on the bounce, they still feel so far ahead of other teams even without Rodri at points that it feels like it wouldn't be worth dropping defenders. Although I have also ended up in this weird position where I got John Stones, which I thought was going to be a really clever tactic because he was going to actually play in midfield, so I'd get clean sheet points, but potentially he'd get more attacking contributions. All he's done this season is come on in that Arsenal game and get a -1 for conceding the goal.
Yeah, it goes back to what we were saying, isn't it, as well? They're conceding more goals, so maybe all the more reason to do that. I've always been a four defender person as well. 2 centre backs, 2 full backs. That's all I need. I do not want to be overthinking. But I think if you do have more than 4 and you are making those choices, someone in my league made the good point that you just kind of like maybe just you need to give yourself a rule. I will play, rather than sort of making the decision every week and fretting over, shall I play them or shall I not play them? Just, I will play all this defender in every game, other than if they're playing Man City and Arsenal, say. And then you could just stick with that. I think there is a danger of overthinking. There certainly is in FPL. And one of the reasons we play this version of the game is that it doesn't give you as much sort of like FOMO. And maybe a way to get rid of that FOMO, well, not FOMO, overthinking. And a way to get rid of that is to actually just set yourself rules so you don't need to go in the weekend panicking.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a good way of approaching it.
So as I said, Jessy, game week 9's coming up after the international break. Some games with some big choices for some managers to make. And obviously absolutely thrilled that the Premier League will be returning. We've kind of touched on quite a lot there. Well, not a lot and quite a lot at the same time in a short space of time. But from next week, when we're weekly, we can kind of have a bit more of a focused look on the week ahead, the week that's just been. And we invite people to write in with maybe some of the dilemmas that they might have. Maybe, whether they should be playing their Arsenal defenders against Chelsea or whether they really just can't let go of Sheffield United's Jack Robinson and we need to convince them that they do. So please do get in touch with any of your questions, anything you've got to say to the team. You can reach us on email on podcast@fantasyleague.co.uk and on all our social media channels, including on Twitter @FantasyLeague. So that's it for part 1. In part 2, we'll be looking at the Garrett Lane Wines Fantasy League.
So obviously part of the reason we all love Fantasy League is the uniqueness, that ability to come up with your own traditions, your own ways of playing and make that part of your weekly fantasy league. So we wanted to feature some of these different leagues to find out more about how the fantasy league community plays this game. From the oldest leagues still in existence, the biggest, the smallest celebrities, the ones with the overly extravagant auctions to the ones with overly complicated rules and all the strange customs and traditions they abide by, we will be doing a deep dive into leagues from all over the world every single week. But where better to start than with Chris Pilal's own Garrett Lane Wines Fantasy League? Chris, tell us in one sentence initially what the Garrett Lane Wines Fantasy League is like.
In one sentence, wow. The best way to describe it, oh my God. The best way to describe it, the Garrett Lane Wines Fantasy League is very try-hard, actually, The way that I think about it is in what it's trying to do. The best way to describe it would be to perhaps to ask the spouses of everyone involved what they really think of it and how embarrassing it is. The fact that the so-called Garrett Lane Wines Fantasy League, because it is named after the sponsor, my local off-license, Garrett Lane Wines, and the fact that it's got its own podcast with 10 listeners every week, everything that we try and do around it that way, it's embarrassing. Maybe it's embarrassing.
Try hard and embarrassing. I love it. That is what Fantasy League should be, I'm sure. Let's start with the league's name, Garrett Lane Wines. It does what it says on the tin, listener. If you think it's named after an off-license, it is named after an off-license. How did you come to the conclusion that that's who should be your sponsor for the league? And what does sponsoring the league involve for Mr. Garrett Lane Wine?
Mr. Garrett Lane Wine, who is called Brendan, and Garrett Lane Wines can be found on Garrett Lane in southwest London. As the league chairman, I kind of went out trying to rename the league, and I went out looking for a sponsor. And you're right, kind of what does a sponsor do? And usually a sponsor would pay a lot of money to have their name up on something where they'd get a lot of more revenue for people seeing it all the time. But obviously we're a group of 10, and even though a few more than 10 know about our league, and certainly a lot more will do now, the sort of traditional route of going after kind of local breweries and that sort of thing, which is something that we tried, honestly, no one was really interested. They didn't really see what they were going to get out of it. Well, they could look at themselves now. Brendan will be the one laughing as this podcast goes out, because now so many more people are going to find out about our league and perhaps even about Garrett Lane Wines. And so I walked into my local off license, which is run by this brilliant man, Brendan, and kind of didn't really give him much of a choice. By that point, it's sort of been whittled down. This is the only person that is going to do it. And I told him, look, this is happening. We're playing fantasy football. We're going to name ourselves after your off license. We're going to come in here once a month, and we're going to get a Manager of the Month prize, which you can award, and the trophy can go up on the wall. And it started off by him giving us a few cans of beer, but then it realised that we were coming back every month. So actually, he's not even fronting up the cash himself anymore. He gets the much better deal out of it. But it's the place that we go once a month where he gives the Manager of the Month a can of beer, and it's also where our trophy lives on the shelf above the till at Garrett Lane Wines.
Every brewery marketing manager in southwest London absolutely kicking themselves after that. You did say you weren't sure that whether Brendan really understands what Fantasy League is, though. You're just a bunch of men who come to his shop once a month.
Yeah, I think someone in the group, because obviously I share these videos, I'll go in and I'll do the Manager of the Month award, and say, okay, here we go, Brendan. Reese has won it this month. Do you want to do a little video for Reese? And it's very cute in the video, but it's also, he looks quite confused. And someone in our league did question early on, saying, are his family aware of this? I don't want him to think that he's being bullied or anything, that people are making fun of him. And every single time I do go in, I do find myself explaining a bit less each time. So the first few times, he was very keen to find out where we were playing football, where our team was playing football, whether it was in the pitches up the road. And no.
It's on the internet.
And I showed him the app. I showed him the fantasyleague.com app, and I showed him the website. And he's a big Arsenal fan. So, I was like, look, I've got Ben White in my team. And he kind of understood. But then he kind of, by the time a month goes by and I come back again, he'd forgotten everything that he had understood. But slowly piecing this thing together. And I do see him around. I saw him in the pub the other day, and he came over to say hello. So I don't think he is scared of me. I don't think he's worried anymore, and perhaps maybe his friends and family aren't either. And like I say, the trophy sits really proudly up on his shelf, and he says that a lot of people ask him about it. So yeah, I think he might not have a full grasp on super subs and manual assists and everything like that, but I think he slowly has come around to the idea.
One of the things that made me laugh the most about your league when you told me about it, Chris, was that you have 11 managers in your league, but you only have 10 spots. Explain how this works, because I think this is so clever.
So when we first started playing the league, I think someone, he kind of put a very audacious bet at the start of the season, saying, look, if I'm bottom by Christmas, then I'll resign, or I'll get sacked and I won't be in my team anymore. And lo and behold, he was bottom at Christmas. And so we kind of found ourselves in a situation where we had to fire him and find someone else to replace him. So we brought someone else in. And then we realised actually this is quite good. This adds a lot of like a level of jeopardy. And we've kept it every season. So how it works is if you're bottom of the league at Christmas, you get fired and the surplus manager takes over. And then if you're bottom at the end of the season, you get fired and the surplus manager takes over. Now this might seem unfair because if you're bottom at Christmas, then you're probably, your odds on going to be bottom or towards the bottom at the end of the season. But last season, someone came in, Mike came in, took over the team at bottom, sold off loads of players, generated loads of cash, went out buying more players and moved 2 places up in the league. So he kind of showed what is possible and it's made it even more exciting. So we don't really know at Christmas, and it's going to happen again. And you might think as well that's a bit boring for the 11th person to just kind of like be sitting and staring and watching. I mean, doesn't even have access to the website to be able to see other people's leagues, but the WhatsApp group is quite active. But this person then becomes our independent adjudicator. Again, like I said, might sound boring, but what this person does is that he is suddenly the sort of the judge for anything contentious that might happen during the season. And he also helps on the monthly transfer window, which we do kind of strictly through WhatsApp. We don't actually use the sealed bids function. It's something we've been doing for a long time, but we actually, you write to this person, the independent adjudicator, who the players that you'd like to go for, and then he does a big reveal the next day saying, who's got who. So there is a role for the 11th person, but they're just, chomping at the bit, itching to get playing Fantasy League, and they're given the opportunity every 6 months.
That's a really great way of doing it. And you did touch on when you started talking about being a try-hard league that you have your own podcast, which I guess is now a rival to In a Different League, as potentially one of the only other Fantasy League podcasts that exist. Although, listener, if you have your own Fantasy League podcast, of course, let us know. How did that come about? I've watched the video. It's great. It feels very niche, but great.
Well, it's very niche because I don't think that more than, like I say, it's got an audience of 10, well, an audience of 11, but I don't think anyone else would really understand what's going on. Like I said, I feel the fact that I called it tragic and embarrassing, it's kind of the first time I've ever really maybe described it in that way, because I've always been sort of like a champion for our own league and trying to push, be very positive about it the whole time. But we did decide that we wanted to, they just decided they weren't getting enough content. The WhatsApp group wasn't enough. We wanted to find out more about the different managers. It's a league which came together a couple of years ago, where not everyone knew each other, which was quite nice actually. So it was a good opportunity to kind of like get to know people and to find out about them and to ridicule the managers who weren't doing particularly well. And so we just decided to do this video once a month, which is then called the podcast, which we release amongst ourselves. It's me and one of the other managers who's the co-host, and then we get guests on, but the guests are also one of the managers from the league who come on. Having said that, we have had some external guests, and obviously, it's the place where I released the video, the Brendan Manager of the Month video from Garrett Lane Wines. We've had the partners of 2 of the managers were on the podcast last month, where they were sort of like talking about their partner's obsession with Fantasy League and how much they hated it. That was interesting. We had a kind of like a contentious issue in the auction at the start of this season, where someone ended up with 3 Man United players, where our rule is that they should only end up having 2, and there was a big question mark.
Is this the Lisandro debacle?
This is the Lisandro debacle.
I want to dig into this Lisandro debacle.
So the Lisandro debacle was explored on the podcast on episode 2 this year, and we brought in a lawyer to decide who was the who was at fault, because as league chairman I put in a kind of auction organising committee at the start of the season, saying that 2 of our members would be in charge of organising the auction, setting a date, everything like that. So that was Toby and Sam. And on the night of the auction, they were sort of like running the proceedings, and one of them said that he would be in charge of keeping a tally of how many players everyone had per team, because we've got a 2 per club rule. And so he said, look, I'll keep a tally and I'll let you know if you've got too many players and you can't make a bid anymore. So Toby was in charge of that. And one of the managers already had 2 Man United players, went for Lisandro Martinez, didn't get told by Toby, And it kind of created a bit of chaos when we found out later that evening. Obviously, the auction had continued and there was a big mess that had to be rectified. But the big question was, who was at fault? Was it Johnny, the manager, who had gone for Lisandro Martinez? Or was it Toby, the auction organising committee, who had put himself in charge of keeping a tally? And so we got a lawyer onto the podcast and he decided that actually it was the organising committee, Toby, who was at fault. And he brought in precedents and all this sort of thing to decide. So, really sort of like deep stuff that we've got to unpick in the Garrett Lane Wines Fantasy League.
I hope there was Johnny got in the lawyer on a no fault, no fee deal to make sure he wasn't coughing up as a result. I've got one more question, I guess. You've obviously been playing Fantasy League since 2012. But this league didn't start till 2021. Is Garrett Lane Wines Fantasy League the European Super League of Fantasy League?
Well,
your breakaway league?
I don't think that the old league that I used to play in had quite sort of like the big protests that the European Super League inspired. And the breakaway league has ended up turning into what it is. I've been playing since 2012. And very grateful to Ben Littleton and all of his and the league that he was running to sort of like opening my eyes, introducing me into the world of Fantasy League as opposed to FPL, which I was growing a bit tired of. And it was kind of like you would have known, and a lot of our listeners will resonate with them. That kind of water cooler conversation at the office. Oh, do you play fantasy football? And it's always but I play a different version of the game, and I kept telling people about it, how much I'd fallen in love with this version, the fact that we've got the auction, it's a unique team and everything, and that included some of my friends saying, look, this is the version of the game that I've been playing. This is the way to play. This is the way to play, and it created so much of a desire amongst a few of my friends to actually play this version of the game that they decided to. And I started off being the league chairman and kind of like showing them the ways, and I haven't really looked back. So yeah, apologies to my old league, but this is the start of something new. It's not quite the European Super League or the Saudi Arabian Premier League, but it's certainly different. And look, Brendan is very happy person because of it as well. Look what it's brought to the local community.
That is true. That the opposite of what could be argued about the European Super League. You've been community building as opposed to taking teams away from their communities.
Absolutely.
And that's what really matters. Well, Chris, thank you for sharing with us the Garrett Lane Wines Fantasy League. I'm sure we will obviously hear a lot more about it as the pod goes on, just generally. But we wanted to give everyone a bit of an introduction to your league. And next week, we will move on to discussing the Georgeborough Wednesday League, which is my league. So everyone will get a chance to hear about my slightly less esoteric fantasy league. I feel like I should have gone first because my league's going to be not seen as exciting anymore, but no offense to the Georgeborough Wednesday League, we just haven't come up with as many exciting ideas as you guys have managed to.
Well, you just fell for the trap that I fell for at the start. I came in absolutely buzzing to talk about my league and how brilliant it is, but then when you start talking about it out loud on a podcast, you start realising, you start being so disparaging towards it. I'm almost too scared for the Garrett Lane Wines league members to hear this part because I've said how strange and I'll say how tragic it is, but it's not.
Obviously, everyone can judge for themselves, all the listeners. That wraps up part 2 of the pod. We will be back in just a sec with part 3, where we'll be talking to Mr. Neil Mansfield himself.
So it'd be wrong for us to admit it hasn't been the smoothest start to the season, and the Fantasy League community interaction has been at an all-time high for perhaps all the wrong reasons. Well, we're delighted that the old, or is it new, or is it old, website is up and running. There's news of the app returning, as well as the head-to-head leagues, the European competitions too. And with us today is Neil Mansfield, one of the men behind the scenes at Fantasy League Towers, or as we call them in the Garrett Lane Wines Fantasy League head office. Neil, how's it been? Quiet summer? Refreshed?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Jessy. Hi, Chris. It's been, well, as you kind of alluded to, slightly bonkers for all the wrong reasons, really. Look, I think the first thing to say is that I too am a manager. I'm not someone that sits behind the game and just sort of runs it. I've actually played the game for 25 years, and I've got my own sort of stories to tell, hopefully some of which may come out during the sort of the following weeks of the podcast. But much like everyone that plays the game, I just want it to work. And I think that's the mentality and the philosophy behind the whole sort of game. And the conversations I've had with chairs and managers over the last couple of weeks is pretty much exactly that. We just want the game to work. So yes, it has been a rather busy 4 to 5 weeks, when we've made the call to move back to the old platform, but for the right reasons in the end. And hopefully now we can sort of take the game forward for the rest of the season and build on the strengths that the old platform had. And don't get me wrong, there are some inherent weaknesses that the old platform has, and that's not going to go away this season. But the positivity, that it generated when we decided to move back was enough, forward momentum to sort of take us through to the end of the season for sure.
What were sort of some of the reasons that you were looking to move towards a new platform, and what have been some of the difficulties behind that? I think it would just be good to hear, sort of what the journey's been like from your side this summer.
Yeah, so the real simple reasoning behind it is that everyone knows that, come the end of the season, that magic last day of the season crescendo, everyone builds up towards this fantastic finale. And there are always, issues with people trying to get onto the site, for the right reasons, because that's, it's the last day of the season where everyone's kicking off at the same time, and you can only play 11 players. So you want to wait until that last moment, and that causes untold sort of system issues. And even if we threw 1,000 servers at it, the way that the underlying sort of database is actually built and written, it just can't cope. So we knew probably 12 months ago plus that the system really couldn't take us forward for the next 5 years. So about 12 months ago, we started looking, actually a little bit longer than that. We started looking for a new development partner, and we appointed a dedicated sports development agency and asked them to build a new platform for us that largely aligned itself to how people had played the game. So we didn't want to introduce anything new. We wanted all the core functionality to be there, but just to try and improve the game and in the areas that we know that we struggle with. End of the season. We know when there are lots of people on, the system does and can slow down with accessing elements like the player profile pages. But we wanted the new agency to develop a system that allowed people to be familiar with it. It wasn't something brand new. We don't want to take away all the core functionality. We don't want to take away all the product features. We don't want to take away all the beautiful ways and the unique ways to play Fantasy League. We just wanted it to work, and people to have a seamless, season from start to finish.
Neil, you and the Fantasy League team kind of in the email alluded to the fact that, the community had kind of like come together, but also kind of the reaction that a lot of people had. They kind of come hand in hand now that it is behind us, because it is. Were you surprised at how frustrated people were with the website, and perhaps how kind of emotional it got at one point because of how seriously they take this version of the game?
No, the funny thing is about all of this is that, I went through this 6 years ago. We went through the last upgrade. So from an empathetic perspective, I absolutely got it. I play the game as well. I was as frustrated as everyone else that in particular, the scoring wasn't, as accurate as it could have been. And we actually got the system working about a month before, or maybe 2 months before the end of the season last year. So I absolutely understand and appreciate everyone's frustrations. It became quite an easy decision in the end for Andrew and I to make, to revert the game back to the old platform. So emotions aside, no, not at all. In fact, what I've done is spoken to probably the best part of 50 or 60, maybe even more managers, over the past 4 to 5 weeks. The stories that I hear are we just want the game to work. We love the game. It's part of our history. It's part of our social life. We bring everyone back together once a year. So I think what it did do is it just reinforced what an amazing community that we actually have. And I think we just need to find more ways of engaging. That's a terribly corporate word, isn't it? Of actually speaking to people a little bit more. And I think this podcast is a really good way of doing that. But also when we reached out and sort of said, look, we need some help, from chairs and from managers to help us work through the backdating of points. The response was absolutely incredible. We had too many people. I know that sounds a crazy thing to say, but we actually did. We had a team for the first time ever of about 12 people working through, and I found some fantastic stories that hopefully we'll be able to share with those as well. So it has just reinforced through the disaster, perhaps the opening part of the season was, that we have this fantastic community of people that have this wonderful interest in ensuring that the game works, it functions, and they can celebrate the success, and we can hopefully do that now for the rest of the season too.
And looking forward, I guess, a bit now, what sort of features can we expect to see returning over the next couple of weeks and months?
Right, so it's been a really busy last week. This international break has come at the right time. So as everyone knows, we've been running on a subdomain, which is auction.fantasyleague.com. So as of Monday, we've cut back to fantasyleague.com, so you can now use the game on the old domain. We have also reintroduced, everyone will be pleased to hear this, the app. So the app is now back functioning as it was last season. I think there's a few small issues with player shirts, which was an issue last year, and we're going to be working through that over the next couple of weeks to get that going again. We've also opened up European places for the competition. So the European Cup and the Europa Cup are now open for chairs to enter their teams. I think that date, the closing date for teams, is around about the 30th of October, off the top of my head. So just make sure that chairs that you've entered all of your teams in. We are also working this week on reintroducing the head-to-head or the league series, whichever you want to call it. And we'll have more news on that, probably on email and on our socials throughout the course of the next week or so.
The head-to-head is our League Cup in the Garrett Lane Wines Fantasy League. So if you win the head-to-head, you win the equivalent of the League Cup, which someone actually did do last season despite finishing 6th in the table. So it was a real sort of like proper old school cup run. We loved it. Well done, Kez.
I think that's what's so fascinating about Fantasy League. There are so many different ways of playing the game. You can have league, obviously your own league, and within that you can have your own local rules, and you can use your cups as European cups or whatever it is that you want to do. It's a fantastic platform, and we just hope that for the rest of the season now people will enjoy talking about football and perhaps the manual assist or two.
Yes, indeed. Neil, you listened to the first two parts of this podcast as well, and obviously everything that we're trying to do, including getting hold of as many people for that second part to feature as many of these different leagues as possible. As someone who's been running the site for a while now and also playing the game, like you say, for 25 years, can you kind of like give an insight of the sorts of leagues that are out there and the sort of like people that we may be getting onto the, obviously without naming them, but the sort of like the types of things that might be out there for us to start looking for?
So I think there's the way people play Fantasy League varies so much from league to league. There are leagues that have been playing for, as I said, 30 years plus that used to sort of play when you'd have to sort of fax in your sub changes or your transfers, that have been sort of now passed down through generations. So, I think Jessy now plays with a father. That's a really good example. We've got some well-known sports players that play the game who may or may not be available for a chat on a podcast further down the line. Some rather interesting individuals. We have one of the helper. I'm not sure whether he will mind me saying this or not, but I will anyway. James, who helped us out going through the back dates, he writes questions for Question Sport. So the interaction of people, are absolutely huge and varied. From little small leagues where you might have 3 or 4 divisions of 5 teams in each league because they love the concept of promotion and relegation. You might have leagues who have got 5 divisions of 16 teams in each division, and compete in a sort of a corporate workplace environment. We've got plenty like that as well. But a real mixed bag of teams, leagues, and players.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really exciting to be able to hopefully dig into some more of those stories as the weeks go on. Thank you, Neil, for joining us. Obviously, there's been a lot of things that have been going on. So if there are any questions we've not had a chance to cover off here, I don't think this is the last time we're going to have Neil on the podcast. So remind you can get in touch with us, podcast@fantasyleague.co.uk, or you can find us on @fantasyleague on the website formerly known as Twitter. But Neil, thank you for talking to us today.
Thanks very much for inviting me on. I just wanted to finish off just by sort of personally going out there and thanking the chairs and the managers that came in. So a big shout out to both Tims, to Graham, to James, to Lizzie, Liam, David, Mark, Fred, and Brett, who I forgot when I thanked him on social media. So Brett, there you go, your own little posts on our lovely podcast. So I am available. Email by all means into the podcast at fantasyleague.co.uk, and I'll pick up any questions that I can.
Great, thanks Neil. So this is now a weekly podcast. We're up and running. We'll be back next week to talk all things game week 9, seeing if Ollie Watkins has stayed on top of the pile. I hope so. We'll hear from Jessy's league, and there'll be questions from our listeners, maybe some more questions for Neil, some manual assists queries, perhaps, Neil. Do get in touch, and if you want to be featured on the In a Different League podcast, then please do write in. The email address, as we said, podcast@fantasyleague.co.uk. We can't wait to hear about all the weird, wonderful, fascinating, perhaps not embarrassing, tragic, as I said them, leagues that exist out there. But please do, if you think that is you, then you can say that too. Thanks everyone for listening. Looking forward to next week's episode. We've been your hosts, Chris Pelau, Jessy Parker-Humphreys. Thanks to producer Simon, and we'll see you next week.